female, white, lay, adult from Louisiana, and your missionary serving the South Central jurisdiction with the General Board of Global Ministries. Here on behalf of the South Central Jurisdiction Creation Justice Movement. My name is Elizabeth McCormick, and I am an addict. I don't remember when or how it started. Maybe it was mostly social at first, but then, without realizing it, it began to infiltrate so many areas of my life. I do it at work, or maybe sometimes with my kids or my husband. And even if I wasn't doing it, it consumed my thinking. It happened at church too. When I began to recognize my addiction, I saw that many folks at the church had the same problem, but they weren't talking about it either. In fact, the church itself has the same addiction. It wasn't until our family moved to Mozambique, Africa, to serve as missionaries through the General Board of Global Ministries that I realized just how bad my dependency truly was. It was when I left my own culture, immersed in consumerism, that God opened my eyes. My addiction is to consumption, to always wanting more, and more is never enough. We went to Mozambique to offer our skills and gifts, but I am certain that we received the greater gift. Their culture is not so immersed in consumerism and economic growth. People use what they already have. They borrow from their neighbors, and they buy from secondhand markets. They know how to upcycle and reuse like nobody's business. Folks are not so dependent on fossil fuels. They walk, they use shared transportation, and they pay close attention to their electric and water usage. It was when Amazon Prime, Walmart, an abundance of takeout restaurants were no longer available when I realized just how much consumption occupied my thinking. When I had to pay for electricity by the kilowatt hour, when water was not always available, was when I began to pay attention to the resources that we used. Living there transformed me. I became aware of how stuff, thinking about it, acquiring it, taking care of it, was not the abundant life that God had called us to. I learned that my identity was not in the stuff that I had or the work that I did to get it, but my identity is in Jesus Christ. And we were so much better for it. But now we live here again, and the addiction creeps back in. Maybe you recognize it in and around you too. Maybe the silent and acceptable addiction is robbing all of us of the abundant life to which we are called. The thing about excessive consumption is it doesn't just impact us as individuals. It creates problems for the environment and the people living in it. Problems for our sisters and brothers around the world as well as in this country. Problems ranging from rising sea levels to increased numbers of natural disasters, like we see here. People are exploited to make the products we buy. People living near industrial areas are exposed to harmful pollutants that cause asthma, cancer, and learning disability in children. Rising temperatures mean problems like heat exhaustion, heat strokes, and even violence are on the rise as well. The facts are out there, and you can talk to your conference disaster response coordinators to hear about what's going on in your conference. But this isn't a doom and gloom talk. This is a led talk, led forth in peace. The good news is that United Methodists have been awake and responding to this for decades. In 2006, our bishop shared God's Renewed Creation, a call to hope and action, a statement that calls for a comprehensive response to the interrelated issues related to the climate crisis. In 2021, the general agencies made a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. In 2016, our social principles and book of resolutions were amended to recognize the church's role in caring for the natural world. And at this year's General Conference, several pieces were passed. In the Book of Discipline, a conference caretaker of God's creation was established, along with directives to encourage sustainable practices for annual conference gatherings and for local churches to report their carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions in the annual Trustees Charge Conference report. In the Book of Resolutions, additions were made pertaining to church land use, green team formation, use of plastic, commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and recognizing United Methodist support for global Green New Deal initiatives and legislative efforts. This is so important, but the work doesn't end with statements, commitments, and legislations. Can I get an amen? The United Methodist, years ago, there was the recognition that there were pockets of folks doing the work of caring for God's creation, and there was an opportunity for synergy. The United Methodist Creation Justice Movement was born. It's a grassroots coalition that integrates the creation care work of Global Ministries, United Women in Faith, General Board of Higher Education, Church and Society, and anyone else that wants to come to the party. Several volunteer working teams emerged to focus on topics such as green team formation, developing worship resources, congregational solar support, education, advocacy, and several other teams. The South Central Jurisdiction cohort of the Creation Justice Movement has been meeting monthly over the past 3 years, and we would love to connect with you. There'll be a QR code that pops up shortly, so scan that or come by the table and talk to us. We've presented a number of webinars, individually and collectively, on different creation justice topics, such as federal funding sources for solar in churches. We sought to organize United Methodist congregations in the jurisdiction in their quest to become more carbon neutral and better stewards of God's creation. We also have a grant writer in our group who's put together a sizable grant to help fund these caretakers of God's creation. And so, if your conference would be interested in some of that possible funding, again, please scan that QR code so we'll have your information and can follow up. Our jurisdictional group saw the potential for legislation to be passed at the recent General Conference and wanted to be prepared to be a resource in this work for our bishops and for our church leaderships. Last week, we sent a letter to our bishops, and that can be found on the app in the report section if you're interested in reading it. The purpose of this letter is to serve as an overview of the activity of the jurisdiction's current creation care work and to offer a resource in guiding the mission of the church in each annual conference. We ask that you remember that the resources in your annual conferences are abundant. Fellow United Methodist, creation care work is a call to discipleship and a question of what sort of disciples are we making for Christ? Is discipleship just about ourselves and our community? Or is it another form of consumerism with heaven as the marketing hook? Or is it about the transformation, not only of our lives and our society, but the transformation of the world? In Romans 8, Paul says that all of creation is groaning for our salvation. Creation is crying out for the church to proclaim the good news of restoration, not only for our relationship with God, but with all of God's creation. Discipleship is about being consumed by God's love for all of God's creation. I leave you with a final question. What is consuming you? Amen.